All right, Mrs. Nolan's class, we're going to read just a couple of more chapters of Louisiana's Way Home by Kate DiCamillo. I think I'll finish it tomorrow. I'll read part of it today and then finish tomorrow the whole book. When we left off, Louisiana was in Reverend Obertaft's office. She had passed out during the funeral and was laying on his floor. I woke up in Reverend Obertaft's office. I was on the floor, and my head was on a pillow made out of scratchy tweed jacket. Reverend Obertaft was sitting at his desk staring down at me. "Ah," he said, "there you are." "Here I am," I said. "You fainted." The sun was shining in through Reverend Obertaft's window and landing right on his head so that he looked like a walrus in a religious painting. Not that I had ever seen a walrus in a religious painting. Camels, yes, and also horses, and sometimes dogs, and angels, of course. There are always angels in religious paintings. But you don't see that many angels in real life, though. Reverend Obertaft smiled at me. "Mourners faint at funerals," he said. "It's a common occurrence. But you are the first musician I've ever known to faint mid-song. Miss Lulu is supremely agitated, of course. She likes for things to go a certain way, a predictable way." Well, I understood that feeling. Not that I'd ever experienced things going a predictable way. I closed my eyes. I saw Granny smiling with all of her teeth. I saw Mrs. Ivy waving that bill, and I saw Dr. Fox in his bloody jacket. And then I saw Clarence's wings, dark and shiny, beating out the rhythm of a heart. I opened my eyes and I looked at Reverend Obertaft. "Was there a crow in the church?" "Not to my knowledge." "Oh," I said, "what about a dentist? Did you see a dentist?" "I did not," said Reverend Obertaft, "although I must say they are a little more difficult to identify at a glance." "Did you see anyone wearing a fur coat?" "No crows, no dentists, no fur coats," said Reverend Obertaft. He smiled at me again. I said, "I don't know who I am. I only know that I am not who I thought I was." Reverend Obertaft nodded his big head. "That is a problem we all face sooner or later, I suppose." From out in the church there came the crashing sound of Miss Lulu on the organ. Reverend Obertaft stood up. "Clearly Miss Lulu is becoming impatient," he said. "There is still a funeral to run. Why don't you rest, and I'll drive you home when this is all over. We can talk things through." I closed my eyes. Reverend Obertaft the walrus was going to drive me home. I wondered where that was. Home. Provisions had been made. That's what Granny Mirage said to me. Or was that what I'd heard? And then before I knew it, I was asleep because I was just so very, very tired. Reverend Obertaft took me to the Allens' house. You could smell the cake baking when we were still out in the woods, before the pink house even came into view. Reverend Obertaft knocked on the back door, and Betty Allen opened it and said, "What in the world?" And she opened her arms to me, and I walked right into them. Betty Allen held me tight for a minute, and then she let me go. "There was a little mishap at the funeral," said Reverend Obertaft. "My, but it smells wonderful in here." Betty Allen blushed. "I'm the official baker for the carnival," she said. "Yes, indeed," said Reverend Obertaft. "That is why it is called the world-famous Betty Allen cake raffle. What particular cake am I smelling now?" "That is my pound cake," said Betty Allen. "It's not a fancy cake, but it is a very, very good. It is my great-grandmother's recipe." "Well, it smells divine," said Reverend Obertaft. "I would like to win a pound cake in the world-famous Betty Allen cake raffle," I said. "Oh, honey," said Betty Allen. "How do you feel about Mrs. Allen and myself having a private word?" said Reverend Obertaft to me. "Burke should be home from school any minute now," said Betty Allen. "You can wait for him outside." I went out the back door and I stood in the carport and I listened to Reverend Obertaft say, "I'm very worried about this child." And Betty Allen said back to him, "I am worried too." I could tell that the conversation between Reverend Obertaft and Betty Allen was going to be extremely sad, and I just didn't think my heart could bear to listen. I walked away from them down to the end of the drive, and I stood and looked out into the woods. I whistled for Clarence the same way Burke did, 2 low whistles and then 1 high one. But Clarence did not come. I sat down on the ground. On the drive back from the funeral, I had told Reverend Obertaft my story, or most of my story. I did not tell him that Granny was gone, because I did not want Reverend Obertaft to contact the authorities. In any case, I started with Elf Ear, Nebraska, and the stage and the sundering that occurred there, and I told him about the letter from that fake Granny and how it told the story of a magician walking away from his daughter without saying anything to her at all, and also the story of the Louisiana 5 and dime and the dark alley and the flowered blanket and what was inside of it, which was me. I told him about Dr. Fox pulling every last one of my Granny's teeth, and and about me lying to Miss Ivy about the bill. I told him about the Goodnight Sleep Tight and how it had a vending machine in the vestibule with everything you could ever want inside of it, and also how there was a stuffed alligator in the lobby who was very ferocious looking. I told him that there had been curtains with palm trees all over them in room 102 and how it was wrong for palm trees to be on the curtains in Georgia. I told him that Bernice was holding my suitcase for ransom, and I would probably never see it again. And I told him how I had asked Burke Allen for 1 bologna sandwich, and he had given me 2. And I told him that Betty Allen was making 17 cakes, 17! And that the grandfather, Burke Allen, had given me his bowl of ice cream with chocolate sauce and peanuts on top of it, and that he had held my hand while I ate it. I told him about Beverly and Ramey. I told him about Buddy, the one-eyed dog, and how the 3 of us had rescued him. I told him about Archie, the king of cats, and how once he had found his way back to me. And I told him about the time I almost drowned and that the blue fairy had showed up underwater smiling at me and holding out her arms. And that part of me wanted to go with her deeper into the pond. I told her that the operator on the phone in his office had told me that there were no listings for Trapinski and that had too many listings for Clark with an E and no Ramey Clark at all. And how could that be? And speaking of things, how could they be? I asked him again how anybody could just leave a baby in an alley. How could that be? How could it? Reverend Obertas stared straight ahead at the road the whole time I was talking. And here's the surprising thing. He cried. I talked and he kept his eyes on the road, and I watched one tear and then another tear creep down his sad walrus face and disappear into his whiskers. When we got to the Goodnight Sleep Tight, I said to Reverend Obertas, I want to get my suitcase back from Bernice, and I want to go to the Allens' house because Granny is still unwell and needs to sleep the healing sleep. Reverend Obertas said, please wait here, Louisiana. And he went into the motel office, and a few minutes later he came walking out with my suitcase. The suitcase looked very small in his big hand. And when he got back into the car, Reverend Obertas turned to me and said, I want you to know something, Louisiana. We all, at some point, have to decide who we want to be in this world. It is a decision we have to make for ourselves. You are being forced to make that decision at a very early age. But that does not mean that you cannot do it well and wisely. I believe you can. I have great faith in you. You decide. You decide who you are, Louisiana. Do you understand? I told him that I did understand, even though I wasn't certain that I did. And another thing he said, you will never understand why your parents left you in that alley. It is impossible to understand, but it may be necessary for you to forgive them for your own sake without ever truly understanding what they did, okay? His face was so serious and sad that I said, yes, Reverend Obertas, I understand. But I didn't understand. How could I forgive people who had never shown me any kindness? How could I forgive people who had left me behind without loving me at all? And so it came to pass that I found myself sitting at the end of a long driveway in front of a pink house that smelled like cake, thinking about forgiveness and who I wanted to be in this world. I sat there until Burke Allen came walking out of the woods with Clarence sitting on his shoulder. Hey, said Burke. Hey, Louisiana, guess what? I got the whole thing planned out. I know just where to go and what bus to get on, the whole thing. And just as he said that, I heard my name. I heard Reverend Obertas say my name. Louisiana, he said. I turned and I looked behind me, and lo and behold, I saw the walrus and the blue fairy standing together at the top of the driveway. And even though Pinocchio did not encounter a walrus on his journey, Reverend Obertas and Betty Allen standing there together looks like something out of Pinocchio's story come to life. Reverend Obertas waved at me, and then he came walking down the driveway, and he took hold of my hand, and he said, Thank you for talking with me, Louisiana. I said, You are welcome. And then Betty Allen said my name. Louisiana Elefante, she called out. I wondered if you would like to come help me bake the last cake, which is a marble cake. Me? I said. Yes, you, honey. Is a marble cake with surprise marbles in it? I said. There's a recipe, said Betty Allen. The 2 of us will follow it together. Why don't you go on up there and help her, said Reverend Obertas. I'll get your suitcase out of the car. Clarence flapped his wings and took off of Burke's shoulder and flew away. Reverend Obertas let go of my hand. Go on, Louisiana, said Burke. I'll wait on you. The kitchen in the pink house was painted a bright yellow, and being in that room with Betty Allen was like standing inside of the sun. Now, what I'm going to have you do is measure out the flour and the baking soda and the salt, all the dry ingredients, basically, said Betty Allen. I said, I've never made any kind of cake before. Never ever, said Betty Allen. No, I said, my granny does not believe in baking. Betty Allen put her hands on her hips. Well, for heaven's sakes, what does she believe in? That was a good question, and I considered it. Singing, I finally said. She believes in me singing. Betty Allen nodded. Reverend Obertas did say that you have a beautiful voice. Now here is the flour and the salt and what have you, and also a few bowls and measuring cups and spoons, and I will just put you to work on this counter right here. I measured the flour and the salt and the baking powder, and the whole time Betty Allen was standing at the counter opposite me, humming under her breath. It was warm in the kitchen, and the yellow walls were so bright, and Betty Allen's humming was so musical that I started to think that maybe things weren't as tragic as they seemed. Betty Allen said, maybe when we have baked this cake, we will take a big old piece of it to your granny at the good night sleep tight. That is not at all necessary, I said very quickly. Your granny doesn't like cake, said Betty. Her teeth hurt too much to eat, I said. It is very difficult to eat cake when you are toothless. The world in general becomes a difficult place without teeth. Oh, said Betty Allen, I see. And she went back to humming. We put everything together in one big bowl, the wet ingredients and the dry ingredients, and mixed it all together with the electric mixer, and then poured half of it into the cake pan. There, said Betty Allen. Now we will add the cocoa to the rest of the batter, and we'll swirl it all around. That's the marbling part. Maybe you want to do that. She stood over me, and she put her hands on my shoulders and said, just pour it on there and swirl. I poured, I swirled. That's great, said Betty Allen. Make it as swirly as you want. When I was done, Betty Allen kept her hands on my shoulders, and we both stared together down at the cake, and she said, Louisiana, you can trust me. You can tell me the truth. Is your granny gone? I didn't answer her. I couldn't answer her. I also couldn't keep myself from crying, and once I started crying, I couldn't stop. I stood there in that yellow kitchen in the pink house, and I cried and I cried. I cried because Granny was truly and forever gone, and somehow I knew that she was not coming back. I cried because I was alone. I cried because the curse was not my curse. I cried, and my tears of sadness and despair and hope and anger fell directly into the marble cake that had no marbles. Betty Allen said, we would be happy to help you try to find your granny, honey, but you can stay with us for as long as you need to. You have a home. You can have a home with us if that's what you want. It was such a simple sentence. Why did it sound so beautiful and impossible? Think about it, said Betty Allen. I know Emma Stonehill over at Family Services, and I could talk to her. Reverend Obertas could talk to her, too. We could find a way to make it work, honey. She picked up the cake pan and turned it away from me, and she opened the oven door, and when the marble cake was inside the oven and the door was closed, Betty Allen clapped her hands together as if she had just performed a magic trick. Now, she said, run on out there and look for Burke. I know he's waiting on you, and honey, we would all love to have you stay here with us and be part of our family, but it's your decision entirely. It was my decision, entirely. I went outside, and Burke was there. He looked at me, and my goodness, his eyes were bright, and it occurred to me that they were probably so bright because he had never had to ask himself who he was or where he belonged or where he wanted to be. He was Burke Allen, who was the son of Burke Allen, who was the son of Burke Allen, on and on infinitively. Do you still want to go to Florida? Said Burke. I don't know, I told him. I don't know what I want to do. He nodded. He whistled for Clarence, and then Burke said, come on, follow me. Chapter 26. When I can't think on what I need to do or when I need to solve a really hard problem, what I do is I climb up high, up to the top of that good night sign, said Burke. Well, I'm not climbing up on the top of that sign, I said, because, as I told you before, I am afraid of heights. We don't go to the top of the sign, said Burke, just to the top of the tree. Sitting in a tree and looking up can help you figure things out. Well, I didn't have any more strength to argue with him, and in addition, I didn't know who I was. For all I knew, I was someone who was not afraid of heights. My goodness, it was possible. I followed Burke to the big live oak beside the goodnight sleep tight. He climbed up into the crook of it, and then he stood there and he looked down at me. All you got to do is give me your hand, Louisiana, he said. I'll go on ahead of you, and I'll keep holding out my hand to you, all right? Go ahead, I said. Clarence was waiting on a branch, watching both of us. This here's the first step, said Burke. This is where you start. Come on. All you gotta do is the first part, all on your own. Grab a hold of the tree. I walked closer to the tree. Clarence laughed. Grab hold of that branch right there, said Burke. I took hold of the branch. It was rough and warm. Good, said Burke. Now go on, pull yourself up just a bit. I pulled myself up. Burke smiled at me. He went higher in the tree. Come on now, he said. He held out his hand. Well, I was off the ground and in the tree. I just didn't think I was interested in going much farther. The person I used to call Granny had always told me that I was overly cautious physically. And I suppose I was. But maybe I didn't have to be. Maybe it was like Reverend Overtask had said. I could decide who I wanted to be. Burke said, Louisiana, if you take my hand and come up higher, I will go and get you anything you want out of that old vending machine. And that is always the problem with me, isn't it? I cannot keep from wanting things. I want peanuts, I said. All right, Burke said, and he stuck his hand out farther. An O. Henry bar. Okay, he said. 2 O. Henry bars. I'll get you everything you want, he said. I took Burke's hand. It felt rough and warm, the same as the tree branch. Come on, said Burke. I got hold of you. Put your foot right there. Don't look down. I put my foot where he told me to. I kept hold of his hands. I did not look down, and bit by bit we climbed to the top of that tree. It is the wondrous thing to be at the top of a tree, particularly when you have 2 O. Henry bars to eat and a bag of peanuts. When we got to the top, Burke left me and he climbed down to go to the vending machine, and I stayed and held on to the branch. I looked down, and guess what? I did not feel afraid. I truly did not. Maybe it was because Clarence was on the branch next to me, or maybe it was just because I was done with being afraid, or who knows. Maybe I had never been afraid of heights to begin with. Maybe it was just one more lie that Granny had told me about myself. I don't know. But I do know that I ate both those candy bars and all the peanuts. Burke and Clarence were beside me, and even though the light was fading, I was happy. The 3 of us watched together as the sky turned into a purple kind of blue. Look it, said Burke. You can see the stars now. It got darker and the stars got brighter, and I still felt happy, so I started to sing. I sang a song about sitting in a tree with a boy and a crow and looking at the stars. It was a happy song. I put O. Henry bar into it, and also peanuts and a marble cake, and I did not add any curses or dark alleys. I put only happy things in that song, and it made me happy to sing it. Dang, said Burke when I was done. That's a good song. At least I knew that about myself. At least I knew I was somebody who could sing. That was something Granny had given me. She'd given me a lot, I suppose. Look right here, I said to Burke. That's the Pinocchio constellation. Where? Said Burke. That one right there. See? That's the face, and that's the long nose of someone telling a lie. Shoot, Louisiana, said Burke. That constellation's called the Big Dipper. Grandpap showed me that one forever ago. See how it looks like a big old scoop, and that's the handle to it right there. It ain't no nose. It's a handle, and over there is the North Star, the one that you look for when you're lost in the woods, because then you know what direction north is, and then you ain't lost no more. Oh, I said. I stared up at the North Star. I could not imagine not being lost. We should probably head on back so they won't come looking for us, said Burke. You want me to help you with the climbing down? No, I said, I can do it. You go ahead of me and I'll follow you. All right, said Burke. Have you ever had a marble cake? I asked Burke as we went down the tree. I've had all them cakes that Mama makes, he said. I've had every one of them. They're all good. Your mother figured out that Granny is gone, I said, when we were both back on the ground, and Burke turned to me. She told me that I could stay with you, I said, that I could live with your family. Well, that means you ain't going to go back to Florida then. I don't know what I'm going to do, I said. Do you want me to stay? Burke shrugged. He said, I think it'd be all right if you stayed. I think it would be great if you stayed. And he shrugged again, but I ain't going to tell you what to do. I nodded, and I said, show me again. Which star is the North Star? Burke pointed. That one, right there. Thank you, I said. It seemed like a good thing to know. It seemed like a good thing that the star could keep you from being lost in the world. All right, we have reached chapter 27, and we will finish reading it tomorrow with the rest of the book, and then 5N will be done with the book. And then I'm going to start recording something else for 3rd through 5th graders after that. So tune in tomorrow for the end of Louisiana's Way Home by Kate DiCamillo. Thanks. Bye.